Hi, it's the Book Traveller, and today I am in Edinburgh, Scotland, on a bit of a windy day. I'm stood on top of Calton Hill, and the Scottish National Monument is behind me. I've got a few other video shots of just everything you can see from the top of this hill, which I'll add into this video, and it is absolutely stunning. From looking across, as I look now to my right, Arthur's Seat, Calton Hill itself, both formed by volcanic activity 340 million years ago, but now offering some stunning views of Scotland and certainly around Edinburgh. Looking behind me, behind the National Monument over there, up Princes Street towards Edinburgh Castle, absolutely stunning views of the amazing architecture here in Edinburgh. It is so well worth a visit. It is absolutely beautiful. And behind the monument behind me, there is the Nelson's Monument and other monuments ranging from the 1760s to the 1820s with various people. And you can get some really great views from the top of Nelson's Monument, which is the one that's just hiding behind this tree here. Behind me. But while I'm up the top of the hill here, I'm going to read to you chapters 7 and 8 of Mosquito, which we're still running along with. Hope you're enjoying it so far. And we're getting into the thick of it now. So let's see what happens in chapter 7. If nothing else, his previous life in Liberia had taught Fleming Moose self-reliance. As the only European living in Sasstown, a small fishing village 200 miles east of the capital Monrovia, he had little choice. The company ship came twice a year to pick up the palm fibres, coffee and coconuts he traded with local chieftains on long trips into the interior, but otherwise the dark-haired Dane in thick-lensed spectacles was on his own. To relieve the monotony, he acted as a medic to the local population, and when he could, dabbled in local political intrigue. He could be stitching up a wound one day or running guns for an insurgent tribe the next. That he was stuck there at all, though, was his own fault. Born into a comfortable middle-class family, Moose had been banished to West Africa aged 25 after getting caught forging his uncle's signatures on business cheques. His disgrace did nothing to dampen his patriotism, however, and 8 years later he was listening to the BBC World Service when it reported that Denmark and Norway had been invaded by Germany. After sitting for hours in stunned sorrow and shame, he sent a telegram to the Danish ambassador in London wanting to enlist, only to be told that Denmark was neutral and therefore so was he. It would take another 2 years of trying before he received a telegram from the British Consul General in Monrovia telling him, "London expects you immediately." After an arduous journey which began with an 8-day passage in a 16-inch wide dugout canoe, he finished nearly 2 months later aboard a Royal Navy destroyer that had picked him up after his troop ship from Freetown was sunk by the Luftwaffe. He sailed into Liverpool. SOE then nearly lost him to their bitter rivals in the Secret Intelligence Service. A few days after he'd been put through the cards at the Royal Victoria Patriotic School in Wandsworth, where all foreign nationals were sent for security vetting on arrival, he was given a letter with instructions to be outside Sloane Square tube station at 1400 hours, carrying a copy of the Times under his left arm. Waiting for him there behind the wheel of a car was an army officer. Moose approached and confirmed his identity before being asked to go for a drive. After a short preamble, the Major asked him, "Have you ever done any parachuting, Mr. Moose?" "I certainly haven't. Would you mind awfully doing some parachuting?" The bones of a plan to drop into Denmark to report on German shipping were hashed out, but 4 days later, the Major, employed by SIS, was forced to tell him it was all off, because Denmark belonged to SOE. The upstart clandestine organisation enjoyed an uneasy relationship with the more established spy agency. SIS's chief, Sir Stuart Menzies, known as C, regarded them as bogus through and through, but SOE enjoyed Churchill's blessing and obliged to reach some kind of workable accommodation. SIS and SOE negotiated some sometimes farcical ground rules. When it came to code names, the Greek alphabet, cars, big game, fruit and colours were reserved for SIS. SOE also offered to steer clear of musicians and poets. Broadly speaking, the division of labour was straightforward. However, SIS gathered intelligence, while SOE tried to blow things up. Except in Denmark. Chance and circumstance had seen the princes of the Danish army make first contact in Stockholm with SOE rather than their more established rivals in SIS. The result was that in Denmark, unlike any other occupied territory, and much to the annoyance of SIS, SOE enjoyed responsibility not just for fomenting subversion and sabotage, but also all intelligence gathering. And so, when Fleming Moose arrived, instead of SIS's Broadway headquarters, he was off to SOE's secret training school at Brockhall Hall. On completion of the SDS-1 course a few weeks later, Moose celebrated over a drink with his fellow recruits in the school's basement bar. While firing 9mm pistols at a picture of Hitler, they bet rounds of gins and bitter on who could hit his moustache. They topped it all off by singing "We Are Members of the Special Forces Now" to the tune of "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain," hammered out on the piano by a British Army corporal. It was in that spirit that after returning to London, Moose was asked by the Danish ambassador if by wishing to fight he wanted to see blood spilled in Denmark. Moose was clear that this was exactly what he wanted. His country, he believed, would never survive the shame if it was still neutral at the end of the war. Bloodshed, he told the ambassador, is in my opinion the only thing which can save Denmark from itself. Moose threw himself into the intense training that followed. Based at Hatherop Castle in Gloucestershire, SDS-45, Moose's cohort grew fit on the assault course and practiced parachute landings by jumping through a hole in the fuselage of a crashed Heinkel HE-111, mounted on a cradle over a sawdust pit. They travelled to SDS-51, the parachute training school at Ringway near Manchester, where the extremely short-sighted Moose won special dispensation to jump wearing glasses after breaking his foot on landing without them. Despite the setback, Moose's progress, though, through the training schools was making an impression on both his instructors, giving Hollingworth cause for optimism. A born organiser, he thought. Intelligent, cultured, and in possession of decisive energy. Perhaps they had finally found the man who could turn things around. Unaware that he had become a focus of attention back at Baker Street, Moose continued to relish the training. Best of all, his Brickenbury Manor in Hertfordshire, a whitewashed Jacobean pile that housed SDS-17, SOE's sabotage school. Moose and his class went on day trips to London docks, where marine experts showed them a ship's critical points. A visit to the Cambridge Telephone Exchange was supplemented with blueprints of Copenhagen's main exchange. The railway sabotage syllabus included practical instruction on driving a steam engine. A childhood dream come true as far as Moose was concerned. Finally, there was Bellew, known as SDS-35, SOE's finishing school, where agents were given instruction in code, tradecraft, and the detailed knowledge of the enemy they would require in the field, from the endless and indulgent intricacies of different German uniforms and insignia to aircraft recognition. In one of the final exercises to test their skills, they were given more than a target for sabotage and a deadline. The rest was up to them. Their instructors stressed that this time they must go work armed with a plausible cover story. After one training mission, they were snatched from their beds by 6 men wearing SS uniforms, and their resistance to interrogation was tested through the night. After 6 months of tuition that had also included map reading, silent killing, telegraphy, Morse, extensive weapons training, languages, gymnastics, security procedures, invisible ink, shaking bloodhounds off their trails, burglary, building fake identities, and how to use a carrier pigeon, they now also had an unpleasantly realistic insight into what would happen to them if they were captured. With the completion of his parachute training, Moose was deemed to be finished article and promoted to sergeant, and 2 weeks later to second lieutenant. It's time, he thought, we get down to business. In London before Christmas, Moose took time to go out to the cinema to see Walt Disney's Pinocchio. The wooden boy's nose famously grew when he was caught lying. By contrast, SOE had plans to ensure that their agent's face did not reveal his deception. Always gregarious and personable, long biennial holidays in Denmark had ensured that Moose's African exile hadn't stopped him maintaining a large circle of friends back home. Concerned that he was too well-known and recognisable a figure as a result, Baker Street booked him into hospital to have his looks altered by plastic surgery. He was checked in under the name Bream in January 1943, and the medical staff were told he was an actor preparing for a role in a movie alongside Vera Lynn. To lend credence to the cover story, Hollingworth arranged for the Force's sweetheart to visit her putative co-star in hospital to hold his hand and wish him well. The success of the painful operation was debatable, but it provided a glimpse of the lengths Britain's secret warriors were prepared to go to get to the enemy looking the other way. And there was no one more aware of that than old friend Moose met in London on the same day. Hollingworth brought him to Baker Street headquarters to tell him, "I now have orders to ask you, Fleming Moose, will you be the leader, Britain's representative in occupied Denmark?" Moose and Johnny Bevan met in Copenhagen after the Englishman was posted at the Danish office of Hambros Bank in the 20s. Now, over dinner in Piccadilly, Bevan was one of the very few people with the necessary security clearances. Through Eton and Oxford, Bevan had led something of a gilded existence. He seemed to take the interruption of the First World War in his stride when, after winning the MC on the Western Front, he wrote a briefing and predicted the German spring offensive with such uncanny precision that it caught the eye of the then Minister of Munitions, Winston Churchill. Since the summer of 1942, he'd been running a small organisation called the London Controlling Section, supported by his deputy horror novelist Dennis Wheatley. Their job, as described in their charter, was to prepare deception plans on a worldwide basis with the object of causing the enemy to waste his resources. Bevan also sat on the 20 committee responsible for running Britain's double agents. Catching up with his old Danish friend over dinner in the early spring, he could have been forgiven for being preoccupied with the secret planning for the Allied invasion of Sicily. It would soon fall to Bevan to brief the Prime Minister on Operation Mincemeat, a plan to use the discovery of a corpse disguised as a Royal Marines officer and carrying fake correspondence to dupe the enemy into believing that Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily, would be the focus of the amphibious assault. Knowing something at least of his friend's impeccable credentials, Moose felt comfortable confiding in Bevan about the SOE mission to Denmark. Before paying the bill and leaving, the Dane asked Bevan to look after his signet ring so that it couldn't betray his real identity when he was in the field. It was raining outside. As they parted near Green Park Underground Station, both were emotional. Johnny, Moose was sure, doesn't think we'll ever meet again. Neither could know that over the hard years ahead, Bevan's work would so directly impact Moose's own. They said goodbye. Given the codename Jam, Moose would be parachuting into Denmark with the next full moon. Ted Sismore looked up from his maps as his pilot Reggie Reynolds guided them through the valley, tucking in close to the side of a cone-shaped hill to starboard. The acceleration pressed them into their seats. Over the 4 months since they'd interrupted Goering's speech in January 1943, the pair had flown another 11 operations together, including a return to Berlin a fortnight ago. That had seen them attack at night at 25,000 feet. Today's mission was very different. Ahead, above them, Sismore saw a house clinging to the slope near the summit. As K for King roared past the front door at near 300 knots, the door opened and a man stepped out, only to find himself staring across the top of an RAF bomber's wing at its navigator just 40 yards away. Sismore smiled as he clocked the look of shock on the man's face. The German ducked back in and slammed the door behind him. The two group Mosquitoes had stayed low since crossing the Dutch coast, across the Zuiderzee, where they'd parted the masts of a fleet of brown-sailed fishing boats, then across the Ruhr, way below the towering 500-foot spire of the Ulm Minster church in Munster, spotted 12 miles north of their track by Sismore. And south of Kassel, they swept low over the floodwater from the Edo Reservoir, its dam breached 10 days earlier by the Arrow Lancasters of 617 Squadron's dam busters. Led by Reynolds and Sismore, two of the 14-strong formation from 105 and 139 squadrons had already been lost after colliding and crashing into a hillside while trying to avoid flak. Another had been forced to turn back with engine trouble. The rest pressed on through the Thüringer Mountains towards the target, but fog and low cloud were hampering their progress. With visibility down to barely 1,000 yards, Reynolds switched on his navigation lights to help his Mosquitoes keep formation. Sismore became concerned that weather conditions would make the attack impossible, and then he caught the sight of the autobahn that ran 3 miles south of Jena, home to Germany's glass industry. The targets for tonight were the Schott Glass Works and the nearby Zeiss Optical Instruments plant that built lenses for U-boat periscopes. As he picked up the road, Reynolds opened the bomb doors and advanced the throttles to begin his run into the target. Next to him, Sismore squinted through the clag for any glimpse of it. At exactly the moment the target flashed out of the mist, Sismore spotted a forest of close-hauled barrage balloons tethered at 200 feet around it. He shouted a warning to Reynolds, who was already preoccupied not just with hitting the shot factory, but the sight of 40mm anti-aircraft guns mounted high on 50-foot towers, spewing flat lines of glowing tracer straight at them. Threading his way below the canopy of balloons, Reynolds pickled his load of 4 500-pound MC bombs before immediately pulling back hard on the control column to clear the 16-story building and tall chimneys. An explosion flashed in front of Reynolds' eyes, a sharp thud and a punch to his hand and leg that nearly knocked him from the controls. He ignored it. Things are too hot. Caught in a hail of flak and crisscrossing tracer shells, he twisted and jinked to upset the gunner's aim. Casting his gaze ahead through the smoke, now filling the cockpit, Sismore could see they were on course to pass directly beneath a balloon. He shouted to Reynolds to turn, but got no reaction. As they swept underneath, Sismore flinched, expecting the cable to slice through the aeroplane like a cheese wire, but somehow they flew on. Miraculously, thought Sismore. As Reynolds followed the valley out towards the northwest, still manoeuvring hard to avoid the flak, Sismore continued to feed him instructions about the barrage balloons until the hornet's nest was behind them. Once clear, he took a look at his pilot and saw that his intercom lead had been severed just below his pilot's right ear. Reynolds hadn't heard a single one of his navigator's urgent warnings. Worse, there was blood flowing freely from wounds on the wing commander's left hand and leg. As they climbed back into the relative safety of cloud and turned for home, Sismore pulled out the first aid kit and wrapped Reynolds' injured hand in bandages to try to staunch the bleeding. Their aeroplane had been similarly gouged by flak. From the pilot's seat, Reynolds could see holes in the port engine nacelle and another bigger hole in the wing, just after the radiator and close to the main fuel tank. Air poured into the cockpit through 2 large holes near the throttle box. K for King was also vibrating badly, but much to her pilot's surprise, she showed no sign of giving up on the long night flight home. Reynolds and Sismore landed back at Marham at 11:55 hours after an epic 4-hour and 40-minute mission. After being given the once-over by the station doctor, Reynolds joined his navigator and the rest of the crews for the debriefing with his arm in a sling and a tot of rum in a tin mug to take the edge off. They'd inflicted heavy damage, reporting 100-foot-high flames seen over the shot works, but two more of the force that left Marham earlier in the evening had been lost with their crews over Germany. Despite the shredding she'd endured from the German guns, K for King was repaired and returned to the squadron just days later. Bullets and shrapnel didn't tear the Mosquito's wooden structure in the way they could metal. The unique physical properties of wood were proving once more to be particularly well suited to the requirements of waging war, to the surprise of some. Chapter 8. This airplane, wrote the Beech Aircraft Company in their report, after examining the Mosquito plans, brought back to the States by Hap Arnold after his visit to the Hatfield, has sacrificed serviceability, structural strength, ease of construction and flying characteristics in an attempt to use the construction material that is not suitable for the manufacture of efficient aeroplanes. As subsequent events proved, not least the raid on Jenner, after which Ted Sismore and Reggie Reynolds had the Mosquito's robustness to thank for keeping them alive, they could not have been even more wrong. The ease with which it could be built meant that as well as pouring out to factories all over the UK, Mosquitoes were also coming off production lines in Canada and Australia. Now everyone wanted Mosquitoes. A major plank in de Havilland's argument for planning the Mosquito in the first place was that built out of wood, it would place little additional demand on strategically vital materials. But that wasn't quite true. Aluminium was hardly unique in being critical to the country's ability to wage war. Since 1936, as part of its preparation for war, Britain had been refining plans for a Department of Timber Control reporting to the Ministry of Supply. The day after war was declared, a telegram was sent to the team who would make up the organisation's HQ staff. It read, "Instructed Ministry Supply, mobilise Timber Control immediately. Stop, please. Proceed Royal Hotel Bristol, where accommodation is booked." Soon, headquarters in the Clifton Down Hotel near the famous Suspension Bridge, Timber Control was responsible for all imported and homegrown timber, distribution, inland transport, price control, and finance. They defined what was and wasn't timber and took decisions on everything from the heavy batons used to repair battle damage aboard warships to a request from the ice cream trade in 1940 for wooden spoons, which was refused. Representatives were sent to French Equatorial Africa, British Columbia, and eastern Canada and South America. Those in the Americas were concerned primarily with the supply of specialist woods required by the aircraft industry. Every British combat aircraft used wooden components. A Lancaster bomber needed as much as a Tiger Moth biplane, but it was the Mosquito that most exercised timber control. As early as 1941, it was clear that a contingency plan was required to ensure that production did not stall. Picea sitchensis, the Sitka spruce from forests in British Columbia, sorry about the pronunciation, was used to build the two spars that ran unbroken from wingtip to wingtip. The vast appetite of the aviation industry for spruce in the First World War had seen the US Army militarize its production, using a force of over 25,000 soldiers and civilians. Acceptance that metal had permanently replaced wood in the construction of aircraft meant that by 1939 stockpiles held after the war had been destroyed. Timber Control's representative had to coordinate a massive expansion of supply while also ensuring that grading of the wood produced on more stringent than for the finest acoustic guitars. Lives depended on it. Britain entered the war with a stock of 200 standards of Sitka spruce. To cover the first year of fighting, Timber Control needed 8,000. Strong, light European ash, Fraxinus excelsior, was used for the Mosquito's primary structure. The stringers that completed the machine's internal skeleton to help dissipate loads around the airframe were sawn from Douglas fir, Sutasuga menziesi, sourced from forests in British Columbia and America's Pacific Northwest. The all-important plywood skin of the airplane was actually part of a sandwich comprised of 2 layers of hard 3-ply birch, betula, filled with balsa wood, which was so soft you could push your thumb into it. If any other wood had been used, the Mosquito would never have taken off. Inevitably, it was the reliable supply of balsa wood that was of most concern to Timber Control. As far as was known, the balsa tree, Ochroma pyramidale, grew only in Ecuador, and only the very lightest wood from this fast-growing pioneer plant would do. Concerned that demand might outstrip supply, Timber Control dispatched an explorer familiar with the region in search of an alternative source. After traveling through Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, and Costa Rica, he found none of the quality needed. But in Panama's remote and inhospitable Darien Gap, they discovered the quipo tree, that at the base of its trunk contained wood that was sufficiently light to fall within the narrow density range specified for the Mosquito. Samples of Cavernacea platanifolia were sent back to Hatfield, where de Havilland used them to build an experimental fuselage. It proved entirely satisfactory, and by the end of 1942, a modern sawmill had been built, and on a hot and humid island located in the Tura River estuary, and a local workforce of indigenous people had been hired and trained. Should supply from Ecuador fall short, they now had a backup plan. Demand for the Mosquito still outstripped supply, however, especially now Bomber Harris had decided that, on reflection, he wanted Mosquitoes after all. The raid on Jenner represented something of a culmination of the work done by 105 and 139 squadrons to establish how best to exploit the Mozzie's prodigious talents. For leading it, Reggie Reynolds and Ted Sismore were both awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The latter's citation made note that the fact that all the crews on the Jenner raid were unanimous in saying that it was a magnificent navigational feat. And yet, it turned out to be not just the last low-level daylight bombing mission Reynolds and Sismore flew with them, but the last daylight op the 2 squadrons themselves would ever fly. 2 Group had always been something of an odd man out within Bomber Command. Its squadrons of twin-engine medium bombers like the American-built Lockheed Ventura and Douglas Boston, and latterly the Mosquito, were incapable of delivering the kind of destruction meted out by 4-engine heavies like the Lancaster, Halifax, and Sterling. 2 Group's face just didn't fit, but Bomber Harris wasn't going to have to suffer them much longer. The spring of 1943 saw the structure of the RAF substantially redrawn in preparation for the invasion of Europe. While Bomber Command would remain largely unchanged, Fighter Command would be split in two. Protection of UK skies would fall to a much reduced command labelled Air Defence of Great Britain, while the bulk of Fighter Command's assets would be transferred to the new 2nd Tactical Air Force, 2TAF, a new RAF formation made up of largely fighter bombers, whose role was to support Allied ground forces as they advanced across Europe after D-Day. The day bomber squadrons belonging to Bomber Command 2 Group were also to be transferred to the new formation. That should have meant something like business as usual for 105 and 139, except there was a spanner in the works. Bomber Harris didn't want to let go of 2 Group Mosquitoes. Instead, they remained within Bomber Command, assigned to 8 Group, the Pathfinders. Formed to improve the accuracy of the Heavies' bombing, the Pathfinder's mission was to fly ahead of the main force bombers to locate and mark the target using barometrically fused parachute flares. Skeptical about the Mosquito, the monomaniacal Harris hadn't actually been at all enthusiastic about the creation of the Pathfinders either, fearing that an elite force would seed resentment and division across Bomber Command more widely. But since PFF's disastrous first mission in August 1942, when instead of the German port of Flensburg shifting winds saw the Pathfinders lead the main force bombers in against towns in southern Denmark, their impact had become hard to deny. Equipped with a new oboe navigation system, which pinpointed the target using intersecting radio beams transmitted from the UK, 8 groups of Mosquitoes were leading the charge, descending from their operational height of 30,000 feet during trials on the ranges at Orford Ness. The PFF Mosquitoes were capable of dropping a marker into a 6-yard circle. While that kind of accuracy was too much to hope for over Germany, improving results ensured that the Pathfinder force was here to stay. The loss of 139 Squadron's commanding officer and night fighter during a night raid on Berlin on the 20th of April to mark Hitler's birthday saw Reggie Reynolds move from 105 to replace him. The new squadron boss took his navigator with him, and so when 105 and 139 were transferred to the Pathfinders, so too were Reynolds and Sismore, whether they liked it or not. After a couple of months in the field, Fleming Moose was now properly getting to grips with his own new posting. He jumped from the belly of a 138 Squadron's Handley Page Halifax II from a height of 500 feet above northern Jutland in March. After a rough landing, SOE's new chief organiser in Denmark, codenamed Jam, had crouched down and kissed the ground before making his way to the nearest railway station with the 3 other members of his team. Travelling to Aalborg, they met Fleming Juncker, a prominent local landowner codenamed Mandarin, by the British, who, since the previous autumn, had been responsible for organising the on-the-ground reception committees for all the men and material parachuted into Jutland. Juncker knew Moose of old, not least for the fraud that he'd seen him dispatched to Liberia by his family a decade earlier. Determined to give SOE's new arrival the benefit of the doubt, though, he pushed his reservations to one side and treated him as if he knew nothing of his past. Juncker escorted the new chief organiser to Copenhagen, where he was put up in a flat belonging to Dus Hansen, codenamed Napkin, a brilliant Bang & Olufsen radio engineer who'd built the radio with which Moose's predecessor had first been able to establish contact with London. Juncker stayed for a day, discussing the challenges faced by the resistance, before returning to Jutland. He had work to do. Over the 2 months following Moose's arrival, his reception group would handle the arrival of another 7 agents and nearly 50 containers packed with firearms and explosives. Safely installed in Copenhagen, Moose was in no doubt about the scale of the task. As far as sabotage was concerned, he realised the resistance movement was non-existent. His priority was to make contact with all the different and disparate groups already in existence in order to coordinate their efforts to greater effect. He reached out to Holger Dansk, an organisation named after a mythical giant who, legend had it, would rise from its slumber to fight in Denmark's hour of need. But top of his lists were the communists. Unlike other groups that had grown up in an ad hoc, organic way following the invasion, the communist resistance that followed the launch of Operation Barbarossa drew on had already established an efficient network. His route was in through Mogens Fogg, a 37-year-old professor of neurology at the university and chief physician at the country's largest hospital, and, since Denmark's occupation, co-founder of Frit Denmark, the hugely popular illegal newspaper. The urbane and charismatic Fogg arrived at the corner of Christianegade and Oostergade at 8 o'clock, carrying a bag of pastries and wheeling a bicycle. For the next few hours, the two men walked up and down the street, discussing the way forward in the struggle against the occupation. If, as a go-between, Fogg could persuade the leader of the communist underground to cooperate with the wider resistance effort, he agreed with Moose that a great deal will be achieved. The first encounter between the physician and the parachutist gave grounds for optimism. Between the raid on Burmeister and Wayne and Moose's arrival in Copenhagen, the gears had shifted. After 3 years of occupation, it was no longer enough just to cheer King Christian as he rode his horse through Copenhagen in a show of defiance and solidarity, or to mock the occupiers' efforts to win hearts and minds with military brass bands busking in the city square outside the Hotel d'Angleterre. As the violence increased, ordinary Danes would be forced to pick a side, and neither one nor the other would come without a cost. Monica Witchfeld knew this when, towards the end of June 1943, she met Fleming Moose for the first time. As she travelled to Copenhagen by train, Monica reflected yet again on how she might best contribute to the resistance. The parachutes that had first alerted her to the presence of the Allied help in Denmark's struggle occupied her thoughts. She knew nothing of the technicalities of dropping men and material, but she had land, fields that she imagined might serve as landing zones, and Engerstofte sat on the north shore of Maribor Lake, the largest inland body of water in Rowland. It would be hard to miss from the air. On arrival in the capital, she made her way from the central station across town to Dames Hotel, the ladies' hotel in which Fleming Moose was the only male guest. The SOE chief organizer was introduced to her under the alias Karl Müller, a cover identity he'd appropriated from a dead man. Always drawn to the finer things in life, Moose was bewitched by his aristocratic and charismatic new recruit. On meeting her, he was immediately struck by the thought that he was in the presence of a truly great personality, and conscious that a strong resistance movement in Lolland might hamper any Germans' withdrawal required by a need to reinforce the Russian front, he felt sure he had found the person he wanted to lead it. In her accented Danish, Wishfeld volunteered her supposition that Maribor Lake might make a suitable target for supply drops. Moose was taken aback, knowing that the idea was already under consideration by the RAF. Her insight illustrated her talent, he thought, for putting her finger on the vital point, and she had shown no hesitation in accepting the chief organizer's invitation that she take charge. They discussed the provision of safe houses, recruitment, and the distribution of material. Moose promised he would send her one of his agents, another graduate of SOE's training schools, recently parachuted into the field, to help in the task. For now, he needed her to hide a saboteur until his evacuation to Sweden could be arranged. She readily agreed. When Monica returned to Engerstofte, her daughter, Inky, knew something had changed. Her mother, she noticed, came back from Copenhagen beaming. It was a development that only would dramatically alter the course of both their lives. From here on, their fortunes would be inextricably linked, both to Moose and the fate of the resistance itself. But as the resistance gathered strength, Germany too was about to take off the gloves. And that's the end of chapter 8. Well, chapter 9 will come in a different reading, but let's finish here and let me show you some of the view behind. There is Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. Absolutely stunning. You can walk up there, and can you imagine the view from the top of there? I might do that because I'm back here next week. Let me just spin around past the National Monument and show you out the view of my left shoulder now. That is the Firth of Forth, which runs across to Dunfermline and Inverkeithing, and the town of Edinburgh obviously behind, and that's absolutely stunning. Well, I hope you enjoyed some of the views of Edinburgh today as I walk backwards up the hill towards the National Monument, and hope you look forward to more reading of Mosquito coming soon. Thank you.